Before Elizabeth II became the steady queen the world remembers, she had to learn one of monarchy's coldest lessons behind palace doors. Love could be sincere and still be treated as a threat. Her husband wanted his name to matter. Her sister wanted Peter Townsend. Her family wanted tenderness after years of abdication, war, grief, and fear. But Tommy Lascelles had seen what one royal romance could do to a throne. He did not ask first whether the feeling was real. He asked what it would cost. Under that question, Philip lost the public victory of seeing his name define the dynasty. Margaret lost the future she imagined with the man she loved. Elizabeth lost the right to be only a wife, only a sister, or only a daughter. And somewhere behind the velvet, the old answer waited. The crown first, the human being after. Tommy Lascelles did not wear a crown, and that made his power easier to miss. He did not stand on a balcony as crowds shouted his name. He did not smile from coins, marry into headlines, or inherit the sentimental protection the public often gives to royal blood. His authority was quieter, more bureaucratic, and in some ways more frightening. He knew the diary. He knew the letters. He knew which private requests sounded harmless, but carried a constitutional fuse. He understood that royal trouble rarely begins as public disaster. It begins as loneliness, a private exception, a delayed warning, a romance everyone calls manageable, until the whole palace begins moving around it. Tommy was not dangerous because he enjoyed cruelty. He was dangerous because he could recognize danger before the person wanting something had finished calling it love. The palace needed men like that because the royal family was never only a family. A quarrel at breakfast could become gossip by dinner. A friendship could become influence. A marriage could become policy. A private wound could become a public argument about whether monarchy still deserved trust. Tommy had been trained by class, war, and court service to distrust the beautiful version of any emotional plea. He knew that love could arrive with clean hands and still make a room unsafe. He knew that pride could call itself dignity. He knew that vanity could sound like destiny. He had learned to ask the question others preferred to postpone. If this person gets what they want, what does the crown lose? To make Tommy only a stern advisor would miss the deeper story. A stern advisor says no because he enjoys the sound of authority. Tommy's no carried more weight because it came from a worldview built before Elizabeth was born. He had grown up close enough to aristocracy to understand its codes and far enough from effortless power to respect usefulness more than charm. In his world, mistakes were rarely punished by shouting. They were punished by doors closing. A person became inconvenient, then invitations grew colder, letters shorter, rooms smaller. He learned that power often moves through silence. That made him useful to monarchy, an institution that survives by making some decisions look almost invisible. He had also learned from war that noble language cannot save people from consequences. The First World War left his generation with a hatred of pretty illusions, or at least should have. A bad decision did not remain poetic once men were dead. A weak institution did not remain dignified once it was exposed. Tommy carried that severity into palace life. He was not interested in the argument that a royal person felt deeply because he had seen that deep feeling could still lead to shallow judgment. If a prince insisted that his heart was sincere, Tommy could believe him and still distrust the result. This made him useful and frightening at once. He could separate sympathy from permission. George V and Queen Mary became the great school of that discipline. George V had little patience for glamour when respectability was available. Queen Mary understood that monarchy lived in rooms, rituals, objects, titles, and the exact placement of people around power. She had been shaped by dynastic rearrangement herself, and she knew what it meant for private feeling to be folded away under duty. Tommy saw in her a royal version of the same instinct he valued: form first, feeling later. Together, George and Mary taught him that survival was not sentimental. It was daily maintenance. Deny appetite, control access, protect the symbol. Do not let the public see how much fear lives inside the family. That is why, when Elizabeth came to the throne, Tommy did not arrive as a man with a fresh theory. He arrived as the carrier of an older royal grammar. He had watched desire almost break the line of succession. He had watched George VI repair what Edward had cracked. He had watched the public forgive monarchy, not because it became warmer, but because it became useful again. By the early Elizabethan reign, his doctrine had a history behind it. It was not merely preference, it was proof, or at least it looked like proof to the people who had survived the crisis. Every time the young queen faced a private difficulty, Tommy's world could point backward and say, "This is why we are careful." The Queen Mother complicated that world in a quieter way. She had been the wife of a second son before abdication made her queen. She had watched her husband pushed into a role that exhausted him. She had watched Edward and Wallace become the glamorous wound that never quite closed. Her warmth with the public was real, but warmth did not mean softness toward the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, nor toward any situation that seemed to repeat the old danger. She smiled beautifully, but she remembered sharply. Around Elizabeth, her mother was both support and pressure, beloved, experienced, popular, widowed, and deeply invested in the version of monarchy that had saved her husband's reign. Elizabeth inherited not only official duty, but the emotional weather of people who had paid for Edward's freedom. This matters because the early reign was not a clean stage where Elizabeth could make choices alone. It was crowded with living memory. Queen Mary represented old form. The Queen Mother represented wartime warmth hardened by resentment. Philip represented private marriage under public inspection. Margaret represented youth, glamour, and longing inside a family trained to fear both. Ministers represented the state. The church represented sacred authority. Newspapers represented the modern public gaze. Tommy stood among them as the person who knew how to translate all those pressures into one cold sentence. What does the crown require? That sentence did not always answer the heart. It answered the institution. Philip's wound also deserves more than a passing mention because it reveals how monarchy controls even those it loves. He was not a foolish man demanding vanity. He had given up a career path, foreign titles, a former identity, and the ordinary expectation that a husband could lead his household. Beside Elizabeth, he had to learn a strange kind of masculinity, close to supreme status, yet permanently secondary to his wife in public. The surname question made that humiliation visible. A name is intimate. It is what children carry, what families pass down, what fathers imagine will continue after them. In monarchy, that intimacy becomes state property. Philip wanted something many men would consider natural. The crown hurt a claim. The answer hurt because it was not irrational. If the royal house became Mountbatten too quickly, it could look as if the young queen had been absorbed by her husband's family, and the Windsor name, created in wartime to protect British identity, had been surrendered at the first moment of marriage pressure. The crown could not afford that image, So Philip's private wound became the price of public continuity. Elizabeth may have understood his hurt, but understanding did not give her permission to repair it fully. That is the pattern of the whole story. The human feeling is not denied because it is unreal. It is denied because it is judged too expensive. Margaret's case turned that same pattern into something more openly heartbreaking. She had grown up in the shadow of Elizabeth's destiny, first as a younger sister, then as the spare, in a family whose order had been rewritten by abdication. The public loved her sparkle because it seemed to release pressure from the seriousness around the Queen. But sparkle is not freedom. It can become another cage because the person who entertains a public is still being watched by it. Margaret's beauty and wit gave her attention, not authority. Peter Townsend offered something different from attention. He offered being seen privately, seriously, without the entire weight of a reign attached. That is why the Townsend romance could not be treated as a minor, youthful attachment. To the public, it had the outline of a forbidden love story. To the palace, it had the outline of a constitutional test. To Margaret, it may have felt like the first adult future that belonged to her heart rather than to her rank. To Elizabeth, it was the moment when sisterhood and sovereignty stopped speaking the same language. The cruelty was not only that Margaret might lose Townsend. The deeper cruelty was that Elizabeth had to participate in the conditions that made the loss respectable. She could not simply say, "I want my sister happy." A queen's wanting is never weightless. This is where the video must stay careful. Elizabeth was not a private villain blocking love for sport. Margaret was not a helpless doll without agency. Townsend was not another Edward. Tommy was not sitting forever in a dark room pulling every string. The stronger story is also the safer one. The palace had learned a logic after 1936, and that logic judged every later desire by the fear of precedent. Margaret and Townsend entered that logic and could not escape it untouched. The tragedy is not that one monster destroyed them. The tragedy is that a system once frightened can keep acting frightened long after the facts have changed. That question did not begin with Elizabeth. It was sharpened by Edward VIII. Edward, still David to his family, had charm in the dangerous quantities. He was modern, restless, adored by crowds, and hungry for the kind of warmth the palace had never known how to give him. The public saw a golden prince. Courtiers saw a man who liked affection more than duty, applause more than paperwork, freedom more than discipline. Wallis Simpson did not invent his weakness. She gave it a shape the crown could no longer ignore. She made him feel like a man before an office. That may have been human. It was also impossible for a future king whose marriage could never be only private. When Edward became king, the problem moved from the edges of the household to the center of the state. A prince in love could be managed, scolded, or delayed. A king in love was different. He was head of a church, constitutional sovereign, imperial symbol, and public proof that privilege served something higher than appetite. Edward wanted Wallis and the throne. He wanted the woman, the applause, the private refuge, and the public crown. He explored compromise, but the heart of the matter did not change. The monarchy could not be asked to remake itself around one man's desire and still pretend that duty remained sacred. The abdication in 1936 did not end when Edward left the throne. It stayed inside the palace like a warning system. Edward gave the nation a sentence about not being able to carry the burden of kingship without the woman he loved. It sounded intimate, noble, even tragic. But behind that sentence stood the people who inherited the bill. Bertie, the shy second son with a stammer, had to become George VI. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who had married a duke and built a private shelter around a nervous husband, had to become queen. Princess Elizabeth moved closer to a future no child had chosen. Princess Margaret became the spare inside a newly arranged emotional order. Queen Mary watched one son abandon duty and another son suffer for it. Tommy saw the lesson with brutal clarity. One royal romance had not merely changed a marriage, it had redistributed destiny. That was why Edward became more than a family wound. He became the argument used against future desire. Every later request for love, name, freedom, exception, or mercy would be measured against him. The facts did not have to be identical. Fear rarely waits for identical facts. It looks for a familiar shape. A royal person wants something private. The private want touches church, government, public sympathy, family resentment, newspapers, and precedent. The palace hears the echo of 1936 before the person in love has time to insist that this case is different. Tommy understood the echo. He helped make it useful. He helped turn family trauma into palace instinct. George VI restored the crown, not by brilliance, but by work. That mattered. He had not wanted the throne. He feared public speech. He knew people would compare him with the brother, whose ease had dazzled crowds. Yet he stayed. He read the papers. He endured audiences. He worked with Lionel Logue and forced words through fear because the office required a voice. Queen Elizabeth stood beside him with warmth over steel. Together they repaired the image Edward had damaged. They made monarchy seem dutiful, domestic, sober, and brave. During war, that steadiness became national property. Buckingham Palace was bombed. The king and queen visited damaged streets, hospitals, factories, and troops. They did not erase privilege, but they made privilege look obligated. After Edward's glamour, obligation became a form of moral rescue. Elizabeth watched all of this as a child and then as heir. She learned that the crown could survive charm only if someone stronger repaired it with duty. She learned that public affection was not freedom. It was another form of debt. At Windsor Castle during the war, as sirens, broadcasts, uniforms, and adult silence shaped childhood, she absorbed the household's deepest rule. Never again let the crown become hostage to one person's longing. This lesson did not arrive as a cruel speech. It came through example. Her father struggling at the microphone, her mother smiling through danger, Queen Mary standing for form when feeling might have cracked, Tommy Lascelles entering rooms with papers, precedent, and a refusal that could make people born above him obey. By the time Elizabeth reached adulthood, the royal family needed renewal without losing control. Britain was tired after war. A royal wedding could offer light, but even royal light came with inspection. Philip Mountbatten was handsome, capable, blunt, intelligent, and proud. He had served in the Royal Navy. He knew movement, command, discipline, and practical usefulness. He was not built to become a decorative shadow in drawing rooms. Elizabeth loved him, and that love mattered. But in Tommy's world, love was never judged only as love. It was judged by what it might bring too close to the crown. Philip had foreign birth, complicated family links, Mountbatten ambition around him, and a temperament that did not easily shrink. He was attractive to Elizabeth partly because he seemed alive outside the palace cage. That was also what made the palace measure him. Before the marriage, Philip gave up much. He renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, became a naturalized British subject, and took the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family. The wedding in 1947 gave Britain a beautiful image: a serious young princess, a handsome naval officer, youth after austerity, continuity after fear. Crowds wanted romance. Newspapers wanted renewal. The monarchy wanted hope without danger. For a moment, the image did its work. But royal marriage is never only two people standing at an altar. It brings bloodline, name, rank, precedence, religion, newspapers, government, family suspicion, and the silent question of who will seem to own the future. George VI loved his daughter and wanted her happiness. That made the next part more painful, not less. He was still king, but the strain of duty, war, illness, smoking, travel, and public service was wearing him down. Private secretaries see decline before photographs admit it. They see the shortened days, adjusted schedules, medical whispers, fatigue hidden under ceremony, and the way a household begins to organize itself around a truth no one wants to name. Elizabeth and Philip might have expected time for marriage, children, naval life, small private rhythms before history closed in. Monarchy does not distribute time according to emotional fairness. It moves when death moves. Prince Charles was born in 1948. Princess Anne followed in 1950. Publicly, the line looked secure. Privately, Elizabeth's roles began crowding one another: wife, mother, daughter, heir, future sovereign. Philip's naval career mattered because it was one of the few places where he could be judged by competence rather than by marriage. In the Navy, he could command. He could belong to a structure that recognized his ability directly. But as George VI weakened, that independent future narrowed. The palace did not take it away with one dramatic blow. It surrounded him with reasons. The king is ill. Elizabeth is needed. The tour matters. The heir must be supported. The next reign must be prepared. Each reason made sense. Together they closed like a door. In January 1952, George VI saw Elizabeth and Philip off at London Airport before their Commonwealth tour. He was visibly unwell, but he went because duty had trained him beyond comfort. It was a father saying goodbye to his daughter and a sovereign sending his heir into public service. Elizabeth did not know she would never see him alive again. In Kenya, the message came. George VI had died at Sandringham. For a few hours, Elizabeth did not know that her life had already changed. That delay reveals the cruelty inside the constitutional machine. The office moves before the heart has been told. A daughter is still unaware that her father is dead while the state has already begun calling her queen. Philip was told first. Whatever frustrations would later shape his place beside her, that moment required tenderness. He had to tell his wife that her father was gone and that she was sovereign. A husband told a wife of death. History told a young woman that she no longer belonged wholly to herself. Elizabeth returned composed because composition was the first service demanded of her. Grief traveled with protocol. Mourning had to stand beside accession. Flags, councils, messages, clothes, titles, and language began turning toward her before she could finish absorbing the loss. That was not personal cruelty. It was monarchy's design. The person grieves. The office continues. This was the moment when the lesson of Edward became the structure of Elizabeth. She had seen what happened when royal desire reached the throne before discipline did. She had seen her father pay for his brother's choice. She had seen her mother become queen because another woman was unacceptable. She had seen the family rebuild trust through work, silence, and refusal. Now the old doctrine settled around her. The sovereign does not belong wholly to herself. That creed would shape the beginning of the second Elizabethan age. It shaped her caution when others wanted speed. It shaped her silence when others wanted display. It shaped her willingness to disappoint people she loved when the office seemed to demand it. Elizabeth did not invent that doctrine. She inherited it. From Edward's abdication, George VI's suffering, Queen Mary's discipline, her mother's armor, and Tommy Lascelles' cold grammar of survival. The new reign began with questions that were not only ceremonial. How visible should a young queen be in a post-war democracy? How much of monarchy should television be allowed to see? Where should the widowed queen mother stand now that she was no longer queen consort? What role should Philip have? How far away should the Duke and Duchess of Windsor be kept? How should Princess Margaret be managed if private feeling began to move too close to public danger? Tommy did not need to answer every question forever, but he helped set the early grammar, and grammar matters. Once a palace learns how to speak later, generations often repeat the sentence without asking who first wrote it. One of the earliest private tests was Philip. He had married the queen, but he was not sovereign. In ordinary marriage, the distinction between love and authority can already bruise. In monarchy, it becomes architecture. Philip might share Elizabeth's home, bed, children, worries, and private life. He might be loved, needed, intelligent, hardworking, and loyal, but he could not be allowed to appear to own the crown. The question of the royal house name turned private hurt into dynastic battle. To outsiders, Windsor versus Mountbatten could look petty. Britain had survived war, rationing, empire's decline, and political change. Yet the palace argued over a surname, because a surname in monarchy is never only a surname, it is territory. Windsor had been chosen during the First World War to protect the family from German association. It had carried George V through revolution abroad and unrest at home. It had carried George VI through abdication and war. To change it at Elizabeth's accession would suggest that marriage had shifted the dynasty into Philip's line. Philip saw the matter differently. He had already given up titles, nationality, career expectation, and much of his independent future. In ordinary families, children often take their father's name. Was even that basic dignity to be treated as dangerous? His hurt was not foolish. That made it more painful. A proud man who had given up so much discovered that love for the queen did not mean the crown would let him write himself across the dynasty, the palace, the government, Queen Mary, the Queen Mother, and men like Tommy saw the larger danger. Philip had married the queen. He had not captured the monarchy. Lord Mountbatten's ambitions made the issue even more sensitive. Foreign birth, family associations, and male pride all gathered around a single word. The answer was Windsor. Philip could be loved and contained at the same time. That is one of monarchy's quieter violences. It does not always reject a person. Sometimes it welcomes him, thanks him, needs him, and then shows him the edge of the room he must not cross. Philip's frustration would not be hard to understand. He was close to the center, but never the center, necessary but secondary, husband but not owner, father but not dynastic author. For Elizabeth, the surname decision was not simply a victory of institution over husband. It was a wound inside marriage. She had to be wife and sovereign in the same body, and the sovereign could not bend where the wife might have wished to soothe. If she allowed Mountbatten to replace Windsor, the new reign could appear captured by her husband's line before it had established its own authority. If she refused, Philip's pride was bruised in the place closest to family identity. There was no painless answer. Tommy's world did not promise painless answers. It promised that pain would be arranged in the direction least likely to damage the crown. Then came the coronation. Elizabeth had been sovereign since her father's death, but the coronation in 1953 would make that fact visible, sacred, and national. The ceremony mattered because Britain had changed. The country was still marked by war, rationing, grief, and imperial transition. Television was entering homes. People wanted access, but monarchy still needed mystery. Too much distance could make the crown look dead. Too much exposure could make it look cheap. Tommy understood this balance. A coronation is not only a beautiful occasion with ancient clothes, it is a national argument staged as worship. Every robe, procession, guest, oath, camera, and exclusion says something about who belongs near the center of power. Queen Mary died only weeks before the coronation. Her death removed one of the last living bridges to the Victorian and Edwardian world of distance, form, dynastic marriage, and hard restraint. She had seen the house become Windsor, watched Edward leave, watched George VI carry the burden, and lived long enough to see her granddaughter become queen. Her absence made the ceremony feel even more like a transfer between ages. Elizabeth had lost her father. She had lost her grandmother. Her mother was newly widowed and displaced. Philip was unsettled in his role. Margaret's heart was beginning to move toward danger, and the nation wanted the young queen to carry all of that grief into Westminster Abbey and make it look like continuity. Television created the greatest test. Millions could watch the ceremony, but the deepest sacred moment, the anointing, would be kept from the cameras. That decision tells us almost everything about the monarchy Tommy served. Show enough to bind the people, hide enough to preserve awe, open the door, but keep the inner room locked. Elizabeth moved through the Abbey as a young woman under impossible weight. She was not performing personality. She was submitting to office in public. The crown was placed upon her head while the country watched. For one day, the old rite and the modern screen held together. Monarchy appeared ancient and young at once. It was a triumph, but not a soft one. It confirmed that the queen belonged to the crown before she belonged to anyone else. And almost as soon as the coronation gave the monarchy its great image of order, private disorder pressed toward the surface. Princess Margaret had been near Elizabeth all her life, first as the lively younger sister, then as the spare in a household reshaped by abdication. She was beautiful, witty, vivid, and watched. She had glamour without full authority, attention without full freedom, youth without privacy. The public often imagines princesses as women given too much. In truth, some princesses are given visibility in place of power. They are praised, styled, judged, and expected to remain loyal to a structure they did not design. Margaret lived close enough to the crown to matter, but not close enough to command the trap around her. Peter Townsend entered that emotional landscape with dangerous dignity. He had served George VI as equerry. He was controlled, brave, serious, and connected to the memory of the father Margaret had lost. He was not a vulgar adventurer. He was not a cartoon villain. That made the attachment harder to dismiss and more painful to contain. A foolish romance can be mocked. A bad man can be removed with relief. but a serious romance between two people who appear sincere forces the institution to reveal what it truly values. Not whether love is beautiful, whether love is safe, not whether the heart is real, whether the heart can pass through church, state, family, newspapers, and precedent without setting fire to the room. Townsend was divorced with a former wife still living. Modern ears may miss the weight that word carried then. In the early 1950s, divorce was not merely a personal history. It was a religious obstacle, social mark, and constitutional echo inside the royal household. Margaret was not sovereign, but she was the Queen's sister. Elizabeth was not only a sister, but Queen and Supreme Governor of the Church of England. That fact turned family pain into institutional danger. Margaret as a woman could love Townsend. Margaret as the Queen's sister could not do so privately. Elizabeth as a sister could pity her. Elizabeth as sovereign had to ask what pity would cost. Nobody had to behave like a cartoon villain for the pain to become real. Margaret could sincerely love Townsend. Townsend could sincerely wish for a future with her. Elizabeth could sincerely want her sister happy. The Queen Mother could sincerely understand feeling and still fear consequence. Ministers could sincerely wish to avoid constitutional difficulty. Tommy could sincerely believe the crown must be defended. Sincerity solved nothing. It merely made the pain harder to dismiss. That is what makes the story stronger than melodrama. The tragedy was not that everyone lied. The tragedy was that several people may have been telling the truth, and the truth still could not fit inside the institution. The echo of Edward and Wallace was impossible to miss. The details were different, and those differences matter. Margaret was not king. Townsend was not Wallace. The country had changed since 1936. Public sympathy might be warmer. Divorce was becoming more visible. Younger people were less willing to accept that duty should automatically crush feeling. But memory does not require identical facts to become alarmed. The palace had seen the pattern before: private tenderness, religious difficulty, public sympathy, advisors warning about precedent, newspapers circling, family pain deepening, and the crown being asked to absorb the cost of love. Edward had made the monarchy afraid of exception. Margaret now lived inside that fear. This is the cruelty of the shadow. Margaret had not abdicated. She had not brought Wallace Simpson into the center of state. She had not shaken the monarchy in 1936. Yet the consequences of that crisis reached forward and wrapped around her life. She was not being judged only for loving Peter Townsend. She was being judged inside the fear Edward had left behind. That is the emotional key of the whole story. Margaret paid for a wound she did not make. The palace did not need her facts to match Edward's facts. It only needed the old alarm to feel familiar. Tommy Lascelles had retired from official office in 1953, so the story must be told carefully. He did not personally write every later consequence. He did not create Margaret's feelings, invent Townsend's divorce, or sit forever as the single hand moving every piece. That would be too easy and too false. His power was subtler. He had helped build the logic by which the case would be judged. His legacy was not only in memos, it was in the reflex. When love approached the crown, the palace asked not whether it was beautiful, but whether it was safe. That reflex outlived the man at the desk. Peter Townsend was sent to Brussels as air attaché at the British Embassy. Officially, it could be described as career and service. Emotionally, it functioned as distance. That was how palace machinery often worked best. A painful separation did not have to be announced as separation. It could be dressed as duty, timing, appointment, and practicality. Distance might cool the romance. If it did not, it would at least cool the scandal. To Margaret, it must have felt like exile by timetable. Royal systems often do not forbid love with one dramatic command. They rearrange conditions around love until love must survive. Distance, delay, scrutiny, family anxiety, religious pressure, political warning, and public speculation. Then if it weakens, the institution can say time has done its natural work. But time was not acting alone. Margaret waited. Townsend waited. The public gradually understood enough to care. The story had every ingredient that makes royal sympathy dangerous. A young princess, a handsome war hero, a forbidden marriage, an older divorced man, a sister on the throne, the memory of a dead father, and the question of whether monarchy had any right to demand that kind of sacrifice from the people inside it. After years of austerity, many viewers could recognize disappointment. They understood rationing, separation, postponed lives, grief, and forces larger than personal desire. Margaret was privileged, but the shape of her pain was legible. A woman loved a man and was told the structure around her might not permit it. Elizabeth stood at the center of that pain. Not only Queen Elizabeth II, sovereign, head of state, and public symbol. Elizabeth, the sister, the girl who had shared childhood with Margaret, wartime rooms at Windsor, family jokes, fear, music, and the strange closeness of two sisters raised inside a cage of ceremony. She could know Margaret as no minister knew her. She could remember the child before the headlines. That made the decision more intimate, not less. Elizabeth could not hand the problem to the crown without also feeling it as family. Yet the crown did not let love remain only love. As queen, she had to see church, government, commonwealth, public precedent, and the memory of Edward. As sister, she could see Margaret's face. That is why this story hurts. Elizabeth did not have to be cruel to become the person Margaret could not fully forgive. She had to be sovereign. The office itself turned sisterhood into a constitutional position. If Elizabeth leaned too warmly toward Margaret, critics could say the crown bent rules for its own blood. If she held firm, her sister paid. If she hid behind ministers, she looked cold. If she intervened as family, she risked monarchy's neutrality. There was no clean place to stand. Queenship did not simply give Elizabeth power, it took away the innocence of private mercy. By 1955, Margaret was 25, and the issue could no longer be kept in the shadows. Townsend returned from Brussels. The separation had not turned him into an easy memory. The public wanted movement. Newspapers wanted answers. Supporters of the romance wanted humanity. Defenders of tradition wanted discipline. The church stood as warning. Ministers watched constitutional implications. Margaret had possible routes, but each route carried a cost. She might be able to marry without the Queen's direct consent under certain conditions, but not without consequence. She could lose status, income, position, and the only world that had taught her who she was. Freedom in royal life often arrives with a knife hidden behind its back. The public often speaks easily about choosing love over privilege, but privilege is not only luxury when someone has been raised inside it from birth. It is structure, language, family, identity, and belonging. It tells a person where to stand, how to be seen, what name to answer to, and what the world expects them to carry. To leave that for love might be brave. It might also be lonely. in ways romantic sympathy refuses to imagine. Townsend offered devotion and escape. The crown offered belonging and burden. Both choices were traps. Only one allowed her to remain Princess Margaret. In October 1955, Margaret made her statement. She said she had decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth. The words were careful, dignified, and devastating. They turned private heartbreak into acceptable public grammar. That is one of monarchy's oldest arts. It translates pain into form until the public can read it without seeing all of the blood. The decision allowed some people to see Margaret as noble, some as trapped, some as obedient, some as defeated, some as sensible. Ambiguity helped the palace survive. Clear cruelty creates anger. Dignified ambiguity creates debate. Debate is easier to outlive. Margaret stayed. Townsend faded from the immediate royal stage. The crown avoided rupture, but avoidance should never be confused with happiness. Margaret did not stop being Margaret. She would go on to be glamorous, witty, difficult, adored, criticized, wounded, and wounding. She would later marry Anthony Armstrong Jones, and that marriage would bring modernity, style, photography, conflict, and another form of public pain. But the Townsend decision remained part of her legend because it showed something the public could not forget. Even a princess could be denied by the palace that made her famous. Even beauty, charm, and royal blood could be refused if the institution heard danger underneath desire. For Elizabeth, the outcome was not innocent either. A sovereign who protects the crown from her sister's desire does not emerge untouched. She may appear calm. She may accept dignified language. She may stand beside the institution and let the public discuss law, church, and duty. But somewhere beneath that calm is the knowledge that queenship required her to disappoint someone who knew her before she was majesty. That is monarchy's most intimate violence. It does not only separate lovers, it separates people from the versions of themselves that might have chosen differently. Elizabeth could not be only a sister. Margaret could not be only a woman. Townsend could not be only a man in love. Every private identity had to pass through the crown and be altered by it. That was Tommy's world. That was the world he defended. He did not invent every no. He did not personally create every wound. But he helped shape a palace language in which no could sound like wisdom. Delay could sound like duty. Distance could sound like service. And heartbreak could be made to look orderly. His logic was harsh, but it was not stupid. The monarchy had really been endangered by Edward VIII. The church question really mattered in that period. Public sympathy could turn into public resentment. A royal exception could become precedent. The crown did need discipline to survive the 20th century. He was often right. That is the uncomfortable part. A villain would be easier. A villain breaks hearts because he enjoys power. Tommy Lascelles was colder than that. He could look at a feeling, understand that it was sincere, and still choose the crown. He did not ask whether Margaret's pain was real. He asked what permission might cost. He did not ask whether Philip's hurt was understandable. He asked what Mountbatten would look like on the dynasty. He did not ask whether Elizabeth wanted to be a softer sister, wife, or daughter. He asked what the office required. That kind of loyalty is difficult to admire and difficult to dismiss. It preserved the ceiling. It also lowered the rooms. Publicly, the monarchy moved on. That is what institutions do. Engagements were scheduled, speeches were given, trains were boarded, flowers were accepted, the Queen appeared, the Queen Mother smiled, Philip adjusted, argued, supported, and endured. Margaret dressed beautifully and carried herself with the glittering edge of someone who knows the room is watching and refuses to look defeated. The crown survived. That was always the measurement. But survival is not innocence. Sometimes survival is only the word a powerful system uses after it has taught people to cut away parts of themselves and call the wound service. This is why Tommy Lascelles matters beyond his title. He stands for the cold intelligence behind monarchy, the person who understands that the greatest threat does not always come from newspapers, Republicans, war, or enemies outside the gates. Sometimes it comes from the private sentence that begins, "But I love." Edward had made that sentence dangerous. George VI had repaired the damage by staying. Elizabeth inherited the fear. Philip felt it in a name. Margaret felt it in a man. And Tommy made sure the fear became procedure before it became disaster. The Lascelles principles belong in this story because they show the same mind in constitutional form. Under the name Senex, Tommy set out when a sovereign might refuse a prime minister's request for dissolution. The subject sounds dry, but the instinct is the same. Power must be restrained before it becomes dangerous. Even the crown could not use authority as appetite. That was the inner consistency of his life. He limited princes, husbands, sisters, former kings, and even the sovereign's theoretical powers. He believed monarchy survived not by doing everything it could do, but by refusing many things it might want to do. In family life, that restraint could feel like emotional punishment. In constitutional life, it could look like wisdom. The difficulty is that the same habit produced both. The hand that protected the state could also close around a person's future. That is why Tommy remained so unsettling. His coldness was not random. It was principled. And principled coldness can last much longer than ordinary cruelty because the people who inherit it can keep calling it responsibility. It can become the house style of a family, the reflex of a reign, and the hidden rule by which love is judged before anyone admits judgment has begun. And once learned, it is hard to unlearn. The final question is not whether Tommy was simply right or simply wrong. Simple answers would make the story smaller than it is. The real question is what kind of monarchy survives by teaching the people inside it to distrust their own humanity. If the crown endures, does that prove the sacrifice was necessary? Or does endurance become the excuse used after the apology has been buried? Tommy would probably have disliked the softness of the question. He might have called it sentimental. His answer would have been practical. The monarchy survived. The Duke of Windsor was contained. The house remained Windsor. The coronation succeeded. Margaret did not create another abdication crisis. Elizabeth became steady. The machine held. But the viewer can ask what Tommy did not. Who paid for the machine to hold? Edward lost a throne, but others inherited the burden. George VI lost the private life he had built around fear and family. Queen Elizabeth lost the life she expected as wife of a second son. Philip lost the public victory of seeing his name define the dynasty and shape its public future. Margaret lost the future she imagined with Peter Townsend. Elizabeth II lost the luxury of being only a sister, only a wife, only a daughter, and sometimes even only a woman. Through all of it, the same answer remained: the crown first, the human being after. That was not warmth. That was not mercy. but it was monarchy. And for much of the 20th century, it worked.